Hello everyone, today we talk about the 148 BC Battle of Azotos. This is one of the, let's say, least known battles of the Hellenistic period. Nevertheless, it's particularly fascinating and it can open to various topics that are definitely significant to our broad military interest of the time, but not just this. Essentially, the battle was fought in Azotos is basically the Greek name for Ashdod, which is basically in the southern today in the southern district of Israel. This city along pretty close, at least, or on the coast actually, of the Mediterranean. And it was fought between some Seleucid forces that are actually at this time are involved into a civil war within the same Seleucid Empire. This time the Seleucid Empire is sensibly weakened, has lost most of its eastern provinces, is reduced really to the Syrian heartland, and in part controls other areas. And you know that the Seleucids had expanded previously into Judea, and therefore encompassing the Jewish population that at a certain point rebelled, and causing the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, so the Hellenistic rulers of Egypt, instead fought 5 wars for the control of this territory that stretched between, in fact, today's Syria and Egypt, roughly. That was particularly important for many strategical reasons today we don't cover, but that produced, in fact, quite a pretty extensive amount of warfare. Think about the Battle of Raphia, that also we will have to discuss. And the Jews had rebelled in the 60s of the 2nd century BC, because also in here of reasons that we don't have to talk strictly now, but essentially that all the reasons that you can think of a war for freedom of occupation really is about. Obviously it's way more complex and complicated than that, but it's roughly basically it. It was the Jews fighting for being independent, autonomous from the Seleucid power, that however were still heavily playing into this let's say into this context. And in fact the same Battle of Azotus is really the Jews at this point backing one branch, actually the Syrian branch of the Seleucids at this point, against this other pretendant, that is Demetrius II, that had sent these troops on the Palestinian coast from Crete, actually. So it's a very complicated story, and that's the reason why we don't have the time to look at it. But today we analyze the battle, tactically speaking, as we always do. So maybe we will discuss that specific strategical context on another occasion. And at this point, at the head of Judea, there is Jonathan Aphos, that is basically the leader of the Hasmonean dynasty of Judea, that ruled between 161 to 143 BC. His nickname was Aphos because this would be basically the diplomat, in allusion to this trait that was prominent to him. And he was leader of the Jews at this point, after actually having fought with his brother at the beginning of the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid rule. And these leaders were fundamentally very warlike. They had their basically their all the Judaic vision of the people of Israel fighting against obviously in this case actually the same Athens that were to impose basically even the construction of a statue in the temple. That's where the Temple of Solomon, that's where the thing started. And you know that the Jews have this pretty tormented history actually in the ancient world. Eventually they will rise 3 times even against the Romans, always trying to preserve their independence. No, so also in here it's pretty complicated. Just know that the Maccabees, where we're talking about, were this group of Jewish rebel warriors who took control of Judea, as we've seen, had been part of the Seleucid Empire, and this battle is that they founded the Hasmonean dynasty, and this battle is essentially a part of this extended conflict. Let's call it in this way. So this battle is particularly interesting because it contains, like most of battles of the time, actually, is very difficult to interpret. At least this is, say, fairly linear, because fortunately enough for the, or unfortunately, obviously, depending which perspective you take it, ancient sources, that at least the ones that survive to us, are pretty scanty, right? You know, we think about the ancient world as if that was the light, and you know, after that, you know, we have few sources. It was never like that. I mean, the more we go on after even the ancient world, the more we have sources, and the more it becomes actually very complicated to reconstruct battles. And you know, it's very easy when you have literally 2 sources, and it gets very complicated when you have 30 sources. And I can tell you by personal experience, by studying medieval battles, that this is quite the case. But at the same time, naturally, so the pros of this are naturally that you have less sources to check, to confrontate, and therefore you basically have to stay to what you're told. Then of course the cons are that you know dramatically few about it, and even if you have many other hints that can come from, for example, from archaeology, but also general knowledge of the warfare of the time and of sheer military logic, you don't have actually the exact confirmation, let's say, that that battle has gone that way, because you can, that may be a good hypothesis and it can be better than others, let's say, but you don't have the certainty, simply because the story is unknown and you can't invent it fundamentally. And so also an interesting battle between the Jews and the Seleucids in their respective way of warfare, though, that here we are, however, trying to a bit contextualize in the process, because there is a sort of cliche, generally speaking, when it comes to most of, actually not just for in ancient warfare, but in several other contexts, where you think that essentially these armies were somehow particularly different the one from the other, in that there were certain tactics were, as if, you know, by being characteristic, become interpreted as defining and standard, right? And therefore certain battles are interpreted on the basis of those patterns that, however, turns out are not supported by the sources for that specific encounter. And this is a pretty interesting one, because we don't really know much about the armies that fought here. We have, aside from the numbers, it is also a pretty recurrent problem, but generally speaking, we have some terms now that are particularly important to understand that cannot really be interpreted in a kind of a scientific or categorical way. This is a valid approach and hint and method advice and method to all military history, and particularly the one that precedes, let's say, at least in the West, the 18th century Enlightenment and Encyclopedism, because you always have to bear in mind, first of all, that you should be able to read the original sources, right, which is something difficult because of the languages. For example, I don't know ancient Hebrew. I know just a little bit of ancient Greek, and that is definitely useful, especially for Hellenistic warfare, but not only, as you can imagine. There is this sensitivity that you have to get towards the not just the meaning itself. First of all, you should be I mean, some of the worst mistakes in interpreting these words and accounts comes from the same mistake of the people who should provide you with a decent translation of this. Sometimes ancient sources in the past have been translated by people who were essentially just philologists or linguists that not really know much about, for example, military logic, military history in general, and therefore they just tell you, this is the best translation because it just sounds right, more or less, and that it kind of fits best for what the classical sounding name of the thing should be. And with this, fortunately, it doesn't happen very often, and I have nothing against philologists and linguists, of course, but I have encountered very often these problems. That's, for example, the same mistake that has made, if I'm not wrong, Connolly translating something like, mistake from the Loeb translation is also one of the most standardly used, that simply translated, the term from the Carthaginian, or better, Libyan heavy javelin, into basically a Macedonian pike, and basically on the base of that pretty gross mistake that is really not even, it really doesn't even take a linguist to understand how, untrue and mistaken it is, but was repeated by the historian, which in turn was repeated by other historians, by other people, by illustrators. That's the reason why you have plenty of pictures of Carthaginians with Macedonian pikes, because, hey, that's what the guy has written in the book, right? You can't really go there and like this. And ancient warfare, at least, is fairly accessible to anyone, in the sense that the accounts also are relatively contained. Ancient sources are not this exterminate, let's say, amount of information that you can't recover yourself into. It's still fairly accessible. It's plenty of translations of everything, literally everything that is being written in this, especially in this classical and Hellenistic and Roman phase, is pretty much published, edited, and out there and accessible, so everybody can read it. But also, you should be able to do, at least every time, to check the translation. I mean, even if you don't understand the grammar, the syntax, but at least go pick that name that is referred to and try to look at its etymology more than else, and try to figure out all the various options, because it turns out these terms, but this happened up to the 17th century, really, even in the West, certain specific terms do not have a scientific meaning. This is our sickness of modern people, that we have to consider that every word has a defined meaning you can check on a dictionary, and that's it. Before the 18th century, there was nothing like that. Words, terms were used in a very, let's say, flexible manner that could be adapted. You had to kind of get this criticism, this ability to decline to the particular meaning. And that's why what unfortunately, however, is lacking, because everybody can even spot, maybe through certain etymologic dictionaries and all this stuff, that the meaning is wider than that. But not everybody has that degree of criticism, of historical awareness, let's say, and farsightedness, for which that it is able to contextualize that term in the meaning that it has. So basically, going back to the battle here of Azotos of 148 BC, we have, let's get into the story at this point. So we have basically Jonathan that restores this independent Judea by chiefly by guerrilla warfare, right? And this is one of those defining, say, features of Jewish warfare at this time, guerrilla warfare, right? Because also here of reasons that we can't really explain, but it was fully, at least, but it was, let's say that it was the standard. I mean, the idea that the ancient world was populated just by guys who had something like phalanxes in the stricter sense, in the narrowest sense, we'll see now, or legions, is not really a clear picture of the ancient world. The average ancient warfare was, as basically in all times, about guerrilla, right? And it's really a strong form of war. Whoever thinks that guerrilla is basically just a weak form of a minor form of war, sort of low intensity war. It's really, you know, just trying also in here to categorize without really understanding much. It's actually a very hard form of warfare that naturally requires an intelligence and an application. It's not just because it's guerrilla it has to win. That's the other bullshit that we have been told from the 20th century, that wherever guerrilla is used, everybody loses. This is the pretty you know, illiterate understanding of the average person of today of what really even 20th century warfare has been. But it's definitely a strong form of warfare that aims really at the attrition of this, especially against this, what are today's improperly called kind of conventional armies that, in fact, are meant like the ones that traditionally the Seleucid army could field, were meant chiefly to fight in pitched battles with these big armies of tens of thousands of the phalanx, something that's very complex and sometimes even encumbering, but yet very effective tactical system. The Jews at this point were doing exactly that. They were fighting in their own homeland. They were mostly, naturally, Judea knew urbanization since millennia. It was a fairly advanced area of war, but still there were areas that were fairly wild. There was pastoralism and so on. So I'd say when the whole nation, let's call it in this way, brought itself into motion, definitely there were lots of forces that really were the average, right? Going back to the average fighter at the time, we're talking about chiefly about a guy with a javelin, a shield, and a dagger. A javelin that is actually at the same time, actually 2 or 3 javelins that can also be used as spears, actually, because even trying to find the difference between a lance and a spear, most of the times in this context, is not really easy to do. Obviously, there was some kind of differentiation, but essentially, you know, there aren't much of differences, and weapons are renowningly and universally used in most diverse, imaginable ways. That was really the average trooper that at that point was not really meant to fight normally, at least into those, you know, thickly packed formations, stay on in open field, in a pitched battle, etc. They could do that as well, but they were better used for this kind of, you know, let's say, even if I despise the term low intensity warfare, that, however, like guerrilla, could be definitely very effective, because basically this unit contained in itself basically the most adaptable tactically adaptable characteristics, let's say, in equipment and minds. And then naturally much of this also came from what policy and society was, you know, in terms of, these were all tribes, were the major centers. Think about Jerusalem, of course, one of the most important cities out there at the time, but also lots of other peoples that really fought mostly like in tribes, in clans, and that had therefore a lack of collective training in the measure that, let's say, a Seleucid phalangite could have on average. And now that we have, let's say, defined the Seleucids in this way, let's tear this down, because this is a battle in which actually the term phalanx is used, but actually it doesn't necessarily mean that. This was the pikeman's phalanx that everybody thinks of, for many reasons. Here I can't really tell you whether it is true or not, but the point is that we don't know, and that's why I can't tell you, because there is no answer. And also the intelligent historian is the person who can't say, okay, I can go up here, but at this point I don't know. And this happens with literally all the world's knowledge. When you study these battles, what can show you more brilliantly, who doesn't quite understand much about them, is that who has to be certain about everything, really. And that's pretty good indicator that the person is just a fanatic that doesn't quite know what he's talking about, because these are universally unknown topics on which there is, let's say, a characteristic and natural base of unknown, that an uncertainty that you cannot eliminate, right? And that is something that is actually shared by all military history. and not just by this. So, to make the long story short, basically, as we were saying before, the Jews were playing off this rival claimants for the Seleucid throne, right? And the at this point, the Seleucid enemies of the Jews had raised in these Palestinian coastal towns held by on behalf of Demetrius II by the governor Apollonius Taos, right? Who would be actually the Seleucid commander at the battle of Azotos. And he had been sent in here, in fact, to gain this coastal centers for the Demetrius kingdom. So at this point, one of the actually the most important source of this battle is Maccabbees' first book, actually. So here it's really from the Septuagint, which is particularly interesting also for the language that is used, as you understand. That tells that basically was a provocation for which obviously the Seleucids were literally calling Jonathan forth, right? Because the Jews were used to fight this guerrilla warfare that naturally was very effective, especially into the mountains, etc. So the Seleucids here called the Jews to fight in the open, right? It says literally go away from the mountains. There's a lot of emphasis to this, go on the plains, right? On the plains. And this is important also because we get literally from this the fact that this battle was fought in open ground, in a plain, right, in a flatland, something like that at least. So a real pitched battle. This is important because obviously it is true that Jewish warfare was chiefly characterized by this kind of guerrilla warfare. That's how they had gotten rid of the Seleucid domination, and it was pretty effective. The Jews were pretty famous for use of javelins, slings, bows, etc. You know, even you have in the sling is this kind of national weapon. Thinking about David against Goliath, and therefore here the Seleucids instead say, okay, let's fight in the open. And naturally, this is told from the story of from the side of the Jews. We don't quite have a clear Seleucid perspective in here, and that's as few as we know, and that's relatively sad, but that's also something important to bear in mind in here. So Jonathan, the Maccabees says basically, yeah, he got angry, he was provoked eventually, and he decides to attack Apollonius in name, by the way, of the rival Seleucid Alexander Ballas, and here there is some let's say preliminary operations with the Jewish occupation of Joppa, or Joppa, I don't know how you pronounce that. And finally, the two armies face at this coastal town of Ashdod, or Azotos, in the Hellenic name. So, getting to the numbers, right? And first of all, this is Apollonius had an army of 3,000 horse and actually 8,000 foot. Even here we don't have a particular certainty. It could have been actually more, right? And what is interesting about this so that's all we know about the Seleucid army, literally, aside from, you know, little surprise that will arrive at during the battle, that however is not an extra in here, but it's just a contingent that was comprehended among the horse. Basically, I can tell you now without surprise, basically at least 1,000 of these horses of Seleucid horse were horse archers. Now this is also particularly interesting because horse archery is not really something so iconically associated to the Seleucids, but rather to maybe to their vassals, their allies, etc. But here there were. So always think about this system as very blended. There is actually nothing strange to see in in ancient Palestine, horse archers. There's absolutely nothing. We should abandon this kind of wargamistic perspectives for which, since that something was not extensively documented, or because it was preferably not used, at least from certain national contingents, we should say, well, it didn't exist. It obviously existed. I think that there weren't horse archers, not even in Western Europe. It's kind of naive. And this 8,000 foot, there could be even more. And that were especially drawn from these coastal towns. Now, this is important because great part of the debate, at least a substantial part of it, comes from the fact that, which kind of troops were those coastal cities, right? First of all, there is no reliable data on the even the recruitment potential of these coastal cities, right? And it is reasonable to believe here that we're not talking about really a field army like it could be in a massive campaign, but these were basically militiamen. That is to say something. Actually, some sources say that these were not 8,000, but 10,000 even. So it's a fairly large number, especially considering these these coastal cities that it seems partly exaggerated, but it's still a fairly large number for the time. There can be an exaggeration about this, but at the same time that it could be fielded, especially in a case of emergency. Let's say these were mostly let's say Hellenistic coastal cities. It's even difficult to talk about a specific national composition, or that can say, okay, well, we know that these guys fought in that way. We don't really know. And interestingly enough, this contingent of the Seleucids is called phalanx. We will see now that later that there is someone else who also calls the Jewish infantry as phalanx at this point, but we're gonna get the point. The term phalanx is not, as we think it, defining that specific type of formation with, kind of hoplitic with lances or pikes. Actually, phalanx is a Greek term that really means a tree log, something like that. Thinking about this kind of very physical view of the phalanx as a formation of heavy infantry, because that's chiefly what the nature is of these troops that work sort of like a compressor, right? The idea that this is a tree log that comes against you, and you have to you have to withstand it with the great force, at least not to be overwhelmed. This is literally what the Greek term means, and contrarily wise to what is at least usually known, the term phalanx is applied to a freaking lot of to basically every single heavy infantry body that of any population that the Greeks encountered. That's where you should start to get flexible with this idea. Phalanx is not, in the Greek source, in the Greek language, something that really defines the Greeks or the Macedonians and the system that they had developed, militarily speaking. It's used even for the Celts. It's used even for the Carthaginians. It's really used for any kind of heavy infantry, and it has specifically nothing to do with the kind of internal order or disposition of the troopers, nor kind of tactics that they employed. And this should be sculpted in any person's mind, the mind of every person that wants to approach ancient warfare. Because if you think that, if you read it into a Hellenic source, terms phalanx, and pretend it to equate it to Greek hoplites or Macedonian pikemen, that's not how it works. That's not history. It's a joke. You have to be able to understand what it means. It really, as as approximate as we can be, that's really a body of heavy infantry, right? And also in here, you could naturally debate what is really heavy infantry. Let's stop to heavy infantry, approximately speaking, because that's also kind of problematic to assess sometimes, given that the standards can vary. But let's say something that was heavier than usual, that is to say, a guy with some heavier equipment, swords, some armor and shield and lance, stopping power, actually, not just this ability of advancing that definitely all armies had, but that also here were really performed in different ways, because there is definitely a hell of a difference in the advancing capabilities of a Macedonian phalanx or a Celtic war band, but that have this specific term and meaning. So the idea is, well, but these were Seleucids, like, so if you find phalanx here, you can assume that it was in fact the so-called Macedonian phalanx that all the successor states, including the Seleucid Empire, had adopted. Well, we don't really know. We don't really know because we have no idea of what these troops were. We have no data available on what was recordable there. And it's also, however, there are some hints that would really tend to suggest otherwise. First of all, the coastal centers that were occupied around that area were fairly few, right? And in order to raise a phalanx, I mean a phalanx of pikemen, renowningly, you had to have, at least regional scale power. That is to say that the sheer resources that were necessary to train, and to levy actually a phalanx of pikemen were enormous. And I can't stress this enough. People presume that you can create a phalanx as if that was something, a joke, like just a bunch of guys in a row or in a formation with pikes. That's not how the process and the effectiveness of a phalanx lays in. Phalanxes have to be freaking huge to make a difference. You have to have at least something like tens of thousands of troops that have that combination. Here we have let's say the tactical organization. Here we have something closer to that, like 8,000, 10,000. 10,000 is still, it's fairly enough to have a phalanx of that kind, because the objective of the phalanx is really to have this long line that you can't pass, forming the center that is defended by the wings with cavalry usually, and to avoid encirclement for every reason. This is true actually for every single our battle array at the time, especially in the sedentary populations, and we will see in fact that the Jews in this battle have exactly the same kind of deployment. But in the case of the phalanx, perhaps it was more accelerated, because the phalanx was usually not, and definitely not even conceived to fight, by breaking down and by, let's say, for example, turning on its flank, or changing, or even worse, changing really, verse, making, a front change. It's too damn complex, the phalanx. We will have to make massive videos about phalanx warfare, because it's disgusting how it's gotten wrong all the single times that you hear something about it, and I'm getting sick about this. But here it's highly unlikely that just a bunch of coastal towns from a power that basically at this point was just occupying them from the external could levy from anywhere, in this sense, a disciplined, ordered phalanx. It took enormous resources to put up an expedition like that, even just for building up this area site. You can't even imagine, if you haven't read it or if you don't suspect, how much wealth, I mean money and resources, actually took even just to build a pike. Many people tend to overlook these things, but it's actually something, first of all, hotly debated, but in the best of at least insanely complicated to achieve. So that these guys in the Seleucid heavy infantry were actually pikemen. I highly doubt at best, and I will tend to dismiss it in general. Yet it's possible. It really depends on the kind of local organization that existed. Even the equipment of the phalanges naturally was something that could vary in degree, so you could have very local, pikemen's militia or something like that, but still, that's not really what makes the phalanx effective as it is, also because phalanx has maintained cohesion, and for this reason has to be trained intensely, and that's basically all the trick that it was. So really, in the majority of this warfare this time, it was extremely more convenient in most of the situations not to fight with the old big phalanx. And actually, if you look at the evolution of Seleucid military, you realize that they basically lack the resources to achieve that anymore, and they tend to transform their troops into something generally more similar, in fact, to those average troopers of the ancient world we're thinking at now. That is this. Sometimes you find written, especially at this point in the Seleucid and Ptolemaic military, of kind of Romanized infantry. That is to say that, yeah, the Roman model at that point was being copied by other states, and that's possible, but the point that is often forgotten is that the average trooper at the time was conceptually very close to, in terms of equipment, to what the Roman legionnaire really was. And many people say, oh, how dare you compare? Well, it was literally the same thing. I mean, the legionary equipment evolved in itself from the average Italic warrior equipment, and that was pretty much similar conceptually to the average warrior equipment everywhere in the world, aside from these empires that could have this kind of more highly developed and sophisticated forms of equipment. And really the difference at that point, especially with the Romans, was really the kind of political and social asset, and especially the outrageously violent discipline that was given to those troopers in a way that they could really perform certain maneuvers and start doing that increasingly more effectively, and therefore also matching the mostly encumbrant phalanx system. That, but also in there, too much has been said, in my opinion, in favor of the but we will talk about this in many other occasions. I promise you. That's not like the cheap videos you can find around 6 minutes talking about Roman manipular legion versus, well, they don't even know it was manipular usually in the titles, versus Macedonian pikemen. Oh yeah, the big thing. It takes literally, it takes a freaking lot to explain that thing. You can't sum it up in stupid and cheap YouTube videos that last 5 minutes. That's just to give maybe if they are capable general understanding of what they could look like, were the main features were, but not really to explain why they came to become the one they were, because I personally haven't ever read even a single time anywhere, and definitely not on the internet, how this for example, the Roman manipular religion was formed, nor even a decent explanation on how and why but that is something that, however, it's got much more clearly from historiography, the passage from the Hoplitic phalanx, the classical Hellenic phalanx, let's say, to the Macedonian Hellenistic phalanx. In here, however, I repeat, I highly doubt that the phalanx was used in this case as the Macedonian pikemen's phalanx, let's call it this way. And I'd rather think that this local town's militia was in fact militia that is in every as the average, in fact, of everywhere in the world, like just some guys with a shield, a spear, and maybe some armor, helmets, stuff like that, and other lighter troops of accompaniment, like horse javeliners or skirmishers and stuff like that existed, in fact, even in the Seleucid army and Azotos, as much as, in fact, in the Jewish army. So, in a much more homogeneous context between these two armies, that is usually and instinctively and intuitively believed, because I believe that if you had, it's not that the Battle of Azotos, as we've said, is particularly famous. So I believe that, you know, if you clicked about this the first time, you didn't really know what this battle was about. You imagine the massive, the stereotypical, in fact, Seleucid and Jewish kind of you know, of tactical recipes fighting against each other. But you see that most of the times in real warfare, those could be modulated in quite different ways. That, however, I mean, from those ones, but that turned out were pretty much homogeneous within them. So, recapitulating, the Seleucids have 3,000 horse and something like between 8,000 and 10,000 foot. Interestingly enough, the Maccabees book says that basically the Apollonius was confident in the superiority of his horse, or at least this is kind of implicit from the way it was told. Definitely, you know, horse tradition was particularly important in this Near Eastern contexts, because you know, especially in the Alexandrian tradition and the Seleucid one, there had been a substantial you know, importance of cavalry, as you know. Actually, in the Seleucid Empire, aside from the cataphract developments and stuff like that, cavalry wasn't that massively developed. It was paradoxically Macedonia still prevalent. I made a video about that, an Antigonid army organization. Nevertheless, it was kind of a prominent figure, something that the Jews at this point tended instead to lack, because we will see now that it wasn't really typical for the Jews to have the cavalry that, in fact, Azotos instead they fielded. So, in passing, in fact, from the side of Jonathan, we have the beginning of this campaign where he sets forth with 10,000 troops, right? And at this point he is joined by his brother Simon. Now, if you read the accounts, actually I got suspicious a little bit, because in the same account of battle from the book, the first book of the Maccabees, you have that Simon actually comes into play during the battles, and this complicates a bit the thing. So, but generally speaking, the reconstructions that I've seen tend to say that both troops had actually both contingents had joined before the battle. Also, because from what we know from the let's say the composition of the army, it kind of would have not made much sense, or at least maybe there was some kind of maybe when the battle seemingly lasted long. At least we have this indication that it lasted the whole day long, is because we will see afterwards that basically tells that it ended towards the evening. So it's possible that during the day there had been this kind of maneuvers of reconjunction between these different separated chunks, and that's the debate. Some say basically that Jonathan and Simon joined the battle together at once. I mean, in the same moment. Some say that Simon came later into the battle, right? So, and about the numbers, in fact, of the Jewish army in total, so with Jonathan's and Simon's contingents combined, we don't have any certainties either. There's estimation from some sources says for between 30,000 to 40,000 men, but personally highly doubt of such a number myself, and I believe that a reasonable number would be maximum 30,000, but even I can't imagine at this point, you know, really this truth. But there can be some like that. There is basically this prevalent idea also for part of the uncertainties that we have in reconstructing certain phases of the battle that would lead us to suggest that the Jews were pretty much in numerical advantage. And I agree. I tend to agree with this. I don't think there is. I think it explains part of those unsolved problems. But hey, we don't really know. In any case, probably yes, the Jews had something in terms of at least a couple of tens of thousands, right? So as we were saying before, the main difference in here, by the way, seemingly was the Seleucid superiority in cavalry, but also this, if you look carefully at the battle, it doesn't quite hold, because at a certain point during the battle we will see basically the Jewish cavalry defeats the Seleucid one. So it's, this doesn't necessarily naturally mean that the cavalry had to be superior, but since we have an absence of other evidence in terms of the quality or the composition of both cavalries, actually, there would be a lot to tell about this. However, also relatively to, in fact, the Jewish army, that's as far as we know, right? That there were a couple of tens of thousands of troops, that there was heavy infantry among them, because a source basically says that there was the phalanx in the Jewish army as well, and the phalanx in the way we have defined it, right? And let's stop for a moment in here, because maybe we'll say it later. However, there was also Jewish cavalry, and this is also important. And in terms of cavalry, maybe for the infantry we will comment later, because that also serves to really explain a bit like the battle worked. But one main problem in here is that Judea was not truly a horse-breeding country traditionally. The Jews in Palestine had not much of a cavalry tradition, nor of heavy warfare in general. Right? The Jewish armies, as we've seen before, were this kind of mostly medium level of heaviness of the troops. We rarely find heavily armored troops, this solid blocks of either cavalry or infantry especially. However, this is also debatable in the sense that what does that really mean? Of course, there was no tradition of this, but this still doesn't mean that from a city, from several cities, you couldn't draw with resources, weaponry, armor, stuff like that, and fielding like this. After all, the Jews now had recovered from the Seleucid domination. They had time from the beginning of the Maccabees revolt to, like 13 years from the original the original revolt to strengthen their military. And obviously they were in a condition where war was a pretty evident risk out there, given the political situation with neighboring powers, etc. And for the cavalry, one possible explanation, let's say that the Jews might have basically taken both horses and their armament from booty, right? And actually there is one passage from the first book of the Maccabees that should be in 6:6, where this possibility is actually perhaps indicated. However, it's being suggested, also hypothesized, that part of these Jewish horsemen came as well for the infantry, actually, from territories outside of Judea. There is evidence of this, of other populations, not just in this battle, actually, of at least individuals of other populations that participated into the Jewish army. Interestingly enough, let's remember also that the Jews at this point are allies with the Ptolemies, and the Ptolemies had in Transjordan a clerichy, that is basically a military colony led by the Jews of Tobias family, and that also included horsemen. Basically, the successor states here had created these forms of military system based on the grant of lands, so that especially in this the Palestine basically was in the midst of these two empires on the frontier. So this was an area that was traditionally kind of militarized. There were military settlements and garrisons and stuff like that, and some of them, especially in the Ptolemaic army, were made of Jews as well. So since we know that actually they fought both for the Seleucids and the Ptolemies at the same time, and there is evidence, in fact, of this other of Jewish cavalry employed elsewhere, and there is also this. There are other details we can say in terms of connections of certain Jewish clans with these powers, etc. But we have knowledge, actually, of other Jewish military settlements, for example, in other lands as far as Phrygia and Lydia, that at this point were under the Attalid supervision at least. You know that let's not go too far, but the Attalids basically were the Pergamene successor state. Let's call it in this way, the dynasty that, by the way, in that case, it can be a useful example. They were fairly wealthy, but they didn't have enough land, for example, to field a phalanx. A phalanx of pikemen, just like, I don't know, the Antigonids or the Seleucids or the Ptolemies had done. So that's pretty interesting, because you find that that was, for example, an army that had some sort of seemingly very good cavalry and also relied on this other ethnical contingent. So actually it was much cheaper most of the times to rely on this form of scattered military settlements that originally, like the clericies, were thought in the post-Alexandrine times like as military colonies for veterans. So to form even, and we talk about this, actually made a video, if I'm not wrong, it was called like Syrians, Mesopotamians and Persians in the Seleucid army, that talks exactly about that. So if you're interested, you can go take a look. It was basically the explanation that it was plenty of manpower was obviously needed from the aside from the original ethnic Greek or Macedonian settlers, and there were even certain local traditions. Obviously, these troops were mixed with locals. There was some kind of sense of belonging, a certain even militaristic or edus attached to this idea of passing on the tradition from father to son to participate in those armies, so that when you read Seleucid or something like that, it doesn't literally mean at this point, especially we're in the second half of the 2nd century BC, of literal descendants of the ancient Macedonian settlers. Obviously, they were mixed now and drawing demographical resources from elsewhere because they were otherwise too few. And this, by the way, especially in the Seleucid Empire, regions like Mesopotamia, etc., the local population was pretty large. So there wasn't any other way at the time to control it without absorbing them, without co-opting them. So considering all these factors, it's pretty plausible that Judas Maccabeus, he's buried in Jonathan now, was ruling the Jews, would have called their compatriots basically from all the Jewish diaspora this time. We know that, in fact, Jonathan, Aphos, we have seen it, had this intense diplomatic relations. They had also with his brother, they had established relations with Rome, and even Sparta, that at this time wasn't actually much of a great power, but still they were able to look beyond. So even definitely this ability of calling of other troopers for their of Jewish origin were scattered elsewhere in this broader Hellenistic world was definitely feasible. So these would bring with them all the local military traditions definitely they had partly absorbed. So it wouldn't be so strange after all to see Jewish cavalry, and if it wasn't just for this hypothesis, I would still say, however, that it wouldn't be strange to conceive Jewish cavalry even from a strictly traditional point of view. I mean, the fact that also in there that they didn't quite fight with that kind of tactical element doesn't quite mean that it couldn't be erased or couldn't be levied. And by the way, we don't know about the quality. We don't really know about the quality of this cavalry, so we don't even know how they were equipped, etc. We can presumably think that most of them were definitely light or medium cavalry, not here definitely heavies, but still possible there was an elite of the sort, right? So it's perfectly fine, and so there is nothing, in my opinion, here that is not plausible in terms of what this troopers really, this cavalrymen really could be, and there in the first place. So let me check in here. Going on, looking at Jewish infantry. Well, that's basically a bit the same thing. We've seen that Jewish armies were traditionally mostly about infantrymen, right? And kind of light or medium infantrymen that were kind of flexible and ideal for guerrilla warfare and stuff like that. Now, it turns out that here the Jewish infantry is called phalanx at the same time. And although we will have to explain what they did later, so that maybe we can add a bit of valuable information about them and this kind of level of heaviness or lightness, let's say, of their troops. Let's say that these troops, for having been called phalanxes, which I think it's Josephus actually that defines them like this, well, probably they were kind of something like heavy, right? And certain historians actually have made this. I mean, I'm fine with this, but certain historians have said that in this battle, since there was a phalanx from the other side, and that was presumably even for the Jewish, I mean, for these coastal cities that the militias that the Seleucids had mobilized, this basically was interpreted like that the Jews had to have something as heavy as the Seleucids to cope with them in the phalanx. I've expressed already my perplexities for the fact that the Seleucids fielded actually a phalanx of pikemen, and I don't think it was the case. So even in this sense, I believe that even if the Jewish infantry is called phalanx in here, because it also fought all together aside from the skirmishers in the front line that are obviously distinguished, but the skirmishers do not really have a formation. They are just thrown out there, they're light. They don't have armor, they're just there for running and skirmishing, etc. So it's very different. I believe that there's been this emphasization of the heaviness of the Jewish cavalry for the battle of infantry for the battle of Azotos as well. I think that on average both of the phalanxes in this battle were actually medium infantry, which doesn't rule out that part of them could be, let's say, an elite, could be even heavily armored, really. And also in here it's relative, because what does really heavily armored means? Having a metal helmet or having a metal body armor. It's possible, it's plausible. I would go for the second, of course. But just let's say it was still the ancient world, a fairly materially poor world, and even having armored troops, like heavily armored troops, it's some kind of pretty rare. So I wouldn't be surprised now if really the both the contents didn't have anything like true heavily armored infantry but something like medium that really made the bulk of the troops, of course, of the two armies. I mean, but that wasn't quite like that massive block of, because some historians, I think, have gone as far as saying that the Jews at this point even had the pikemen phalanx, and that's obviously wrong, because there is no single evidence of that in all Jewish history. And by the way, in no other history aside from the one of Alexander's successors. So that is pretty important, and the reasons, without explaining them once again now, are the same I listed before. The actual phalanx of pikemen, as well as the hoplitic phalanx, is something that wasn't basically, they didn't go out of these specific empires and powers, especially the Greek hoplitic phalanx. The classical hoplitic phalanx is something that was narrowly confined into the boundaries of Greece. And don't say no because you find just guys equipped like hoplites elsewhere, because that's not what a phalanx is, and that's where people get it wrong all the time. That they think that a guy dressed like an hoplite has to be an hoplite in formation, has to find. It's absolutely false. I will make at least a 3 hours video to explain this one day, because it's gotten wrong all the time. Secondly, to have, especially, you know, the classical phalanx is essentially a militia. To have the professionals of the Macedonian phalanx of pikemen, you need to have enormous empires. Like, in fact, the Seleucid Empire, and not at this time, it was now shrinking just to Syria, basically, but, you know, the one of the main extent of his power, to draw even the resources to field 30,000 pikemen, because it costs a freaking lot, and the only reason why they did it was that was freaking effective, proportionally. So that's perfectly reasonable. But at the same time, for this type of warfare that was relatively, you know, where resources were less available, it was more convenient to have other types of troops that were the average, by the way, all around. Even the Seleucid Empire in itself, it was not a nation state with, you know, like everything is Seleucid here, only obeys to the military, you know, the Seleucid administration. No, it was full of tribes, of populations, even semi-nomadic peoples. They all fought their own way, and all that military potential was pretty damn, you know, good, advantageous to use, and readily available, and it was pretty effective at the same time. So you have to consider to go beyond the idea, oh, I have the cool tactical formula that I can use all the time because I'm cool. Well, no. Tactical formulas change every freaking time. Not even the phalanx of the same, not of all the Hellenistic world, because obviously changed. I mean, the post-Alexandrian, the successors' world changed, but even within the same Seleucid Empire, the phalanx changed. And let's be serious about these topics, because they are, as a matter of fact. So, yeah, that was the idea, right? So, we can go to the battle. So, what happening here is that Apollonius was definitely trying to make Jonathan fight on a ground that would help the Seleucids and expose the Jews. And Apollonius, seemingly, as we said, was comfortable for this alleged cavalry superiority that I'm not extremely convinced of, but in absolute terms. But we will see now during the clash why this is the case. It could be large and substantial. I mean, nobody tells. I mean, 3,000 horses is really a lot. So whatever the source wanted to mean, and whatever the battle went, still, you know, as far as we know, the Seleucids had lots of horses, but it could be that the Jews partly also had, and we don't know as many, unfortunately. So the ideal was to lure the Jews in open ground, right? Where this, especially cavalry superiority, could play, and that's why I think the sources stress that. Because there is no real attention really to to the Seleucid infantry as such. I mean, if there had been really a phalanx of pikemen, that would have been possibly, you know, much more emphasized, and it would have been quite of a bigger thing after all. Even it would have had more historiographical echo of it in those times. It turns out it didn't quite have. So even when you read Josephus, that was later, looking at this story, obviously he was writing, even using the term phalanx, in a kind of a probably at least in a kind of historiographical cliche like, even though we have seen how flexible the term phalanx really was, even in Greek. So there is really nothing surprising at this point. But the idea is that if you attract an enemy in open ground and you have lots of cavalry, you can play easily, right? Which is different from what we, you know, we tend to excuse me, I was thinking now about the ground, and the point is that this ground was plain, of course, and could allow cavalry maneuvering, but also probably was some obstacle. For the most evident reason that this is kind of the surprise of the battle is that eventually the Seleucids pop out of somewhere that we don't really know what it was. They could have been orchards or other you know, structures that were there, with this 1,000 horse archers in the rear of the Jewish army, which is particularly interesting also because and that's why I think that really that both Jonathan's and Simon's contingents were already aligned, because eventually we will see that these horse archers start to harass the enemy, the Jewish infantry, and Jewish infantry is from the sources under Simon. So and Simon, you know, that's the real problem. So that he had already arrived, even in battle open like that. So that's why the reason I think Jonathan's and Simon's forces were reunited, actually. So what happens in here? I don't know where to start from now. Another consideration that we already made is that both the first book of the Maccabees actually doesn't tell us much of the composition of the Jewish force. This is pretty important. Doesn't enter into detail. So probably these Jewish troopers, including cavalry, probably weren't anything so so strange. So in terms of deployment, so I'll give you this. I sign what I have to. We have this first picture that tells you basically what the standard battle plan really was. So basically here you have a pretty, I mean, the simplest form and the most standard form actually of deployment you can find in any army of the time, and that is and beyond. Actually, you have both, and naturally there is much of conjectural about this because of the contingents story and all this stuff, but this is how we have interpreted it mostly. So you have both the Seleucids and the Jews deploying with heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, and skirmishers in the front. Now this is the most standard thing you can find ever. It basically all the armies at this time, made an exception for maybe nomadic armies, but that's also partly not true because they fought in similar ways, fought, right? And the concept is pure logic. I mean, you have this massive bulk of troops in the center that really makes the toughest impediment for the enemy to break through, right? Which is screened by skirmishers. So troops that can go back and forth, so having this very elastic reaction to any kind of enemy forces, and hopefully slowing down their momentum while they want to attack the center. So that basically attacking the center is the most expansive thing you can do, because you're gonna be slowed down in the meanwhile, excuse me, and you have the bulk of enemy forces awaiting you after you're being worn out. Naturally, the thing gets theoretical because the enemy is going to do the same exact thing. and we will see now, in fact, the engagement is started by the skirmishers attacking the other. So really the element that can make a difference is cavalry on the wings, and cavalry on the wings has the most obvious function to annihilate what is in the front of them on the other side, respectively. So to annihilate enemy cavalry, and therefore exposing the flank of the heavy infantry, and or attacking from the rear, and therefore with the pressure of the infantry or your own infantry advances, melting the force away. So this is really it's a school example, right? That's really how the whole ancient warfare really worked. And obviously there were more sophisticated tactics, but the essentials really work in that way. That also obviously depends on the terrain, etc. As much as we know, this battle was fought in a plain and nothing else. So we give for granted that at least the battle was fought more or less in this fashion. So what happens? Let me switch picture. We are here in the second phase, and we look, in fact, at the skirmishers exchange, and it's pretty obvious. Skirmishers exchange is a basically it normally eliminate each other. I mean, I rarely found situations in which there were two skirmishers in front of the lines. Basically, they were able to break through decisively and to make they mostly annihilated themselves along the way. Let's say it's like when in you're playing chess and you make the pawns in the front, and usually they get eaten up. First of all, these are obviously something more than, well, yeah, they kind of resemble the skirmisher in that sense, but they're cheap units, let's say, and this is the point, because they're not armored. They're actually meant just to run back and forth to skirmish the enemy, and their main objective would be theoretically and naturally to soften up the enemy ranks, especially the heaviest ones, the ones of the the phalanx, in this case of the heavy infantry. But the problem is that there are other enemy skirmishers in the middle, so that's why they normally eliminate each other, because also the skirmishers didn't quite have enormous amount of missiles. I mean, how many javelins could really skirmishers have? Surely there were ways of replenishing them in some ways, but still, missiles cost, and also they weight, and these troops get exhausted as the others, even if they are lighter, so they have usually also better stamina. They're usually younger people that can endure more than exploit their agility and stuff. But and seemingly these two. The skirmishers do not have a greater play in the story. And by the way, here I didn't represent it really, but it's plausible that both cavalries had a certain amount of skirmishers. Actually, in all armies at this point, it was plenty of skirmishers in cavalry, and most cavalry would be about skirmishers, right? Or at least troops that relied heavily on that, because compared to the infantry, I mean, the infantry can still put a stand on foot. The cavalry is based on the speed and this idea of of harassing without being hit more easily, more quickly. So, but seemingly the skirmishers didn't quite have a particular a decisive role at all, of course, and it wasn't normally their task, actually. So what happens is, passing to the third picture, we have this plot twist, let's say, let's call it in this way. Basically, first of all, the skirmishers retreated. It was also perfectly normal. The skirmisher gets exhausted after a while. This doesn't mean that skirmishers disappear from the battlefield. Actually, when you think about these battlefields, here we make the drawing ordered for the sake of understanding, but you have to think that basically throughout the whole battle there were guys running through the ranks and skirmishing, and the same ranks probably most of the times actually were, even if the heavy infantry were equipped with javelins. Yes, it wasn't a prerogative of, I don't know, the legionnaire, Roman legionnaires to have javelins even in heavy infantry. Most of the heavy infantry out there had something like that. The pikemen in the Macedonian tradition didn't quite have, but also in here we saw that probably this wasn't really a phalanx, as we imagined that of pikemen. There were probably troops that were very close actually in composition to the same Jewish ones. So the skirmishers at a certain point naturally they come back within the ranks. They're usually they also have this function of, sometimes they were sent back to the camps. Here we have knowledge about the camps, for example, how they were deployed, etc. But there were troops that were thrown out there. The idea is now that if the skirmishers hadn't achieved any particular result, now it was a draw, and it was from the situation of origin. So what happens in here is that from somewhere that we do not know, the Seleucids make advance their hidden force of 1,000 horse archers. As we were saying before, they might have come out of orchards or some other farms, or maybe some hills, or maybe even vegetation that definitely exists in there. So we don't know, unfortunately. The only part of the story is basically these archers not only pop out unexpectedly, but they're able to deploy themselves to advance into the rear of the Jewish army. Now, as we were saying before, when an army gets surrounded, it's pretty serious business, right? And it's actually a pretty clamorous event. I mean, normally I have difficulties now to think of battles in which the enemy was able to lure someone out there like this and literally, put in an enemy, put in a unit in the rear of the enemy army. That's something extremely dangerous, because, by the way, there is always a contact normally, even during a battle, with the respective camps, right? And this means to be cut off from the camp, so from sources of supplies, etc. So it's an extremely risky business. Naturally, we tend to give for granted, by the way, the fact that staying out there in this most dangerous situation, it's tiring. You're anxious because you can't get killed during the fight. At the end of the day, you may be dead. You are equipped. Okay, not extremely heavily equipped, but I really challenge you even to keep in the hands something like a shield or spear. Okay, you can place them on the ground, but still you're consuming energy. So your body is consuming calories. You're progressively tiring down. Here, I don't think we know in which time of the year the battle was fought, but here, we are in basically today's Israel, and usually wars were fought in the good season, so these weren't really even very fresh areas, right? So even under the heat, it's pretty harsh to be there. You have 1,000 horse archers that basically appear in your rear, and they presumably cut you off from some valuable position, maybe even the escape route, and that's a freaking serious situation. But it can also be a double-edged sword for the attacker, because maybe you can oblige someone to fight to the death, which is not, it's less frequent in a situation like this, especially in open ground, than you may think, because at this point the Jewish army could have even melted away. If the troops had been so frightened, or that the situation was evidently too disadvantageous. But it didn't happen. And it was a pretty serious situation. So just imagine what a commander would do, right? By the way, here I didn't say it, but looking at the cavalry in here, I don't think we have any real indication of the individual wings from the sources. So this is important. This is kind of but especially not even that the cavalry was usually under the same you know, these cavalry wings were under the respective commanders in the way we have shown in here. The important thing is that usually it was the right wing that had the upper hand, for reasons of how the shields were placed and what kind of impact it could do. So even for the shift towards the right, that you know, that always happened. It happened especially in the hoplitic phalanxes, but also in any other army tendentially. So there were some reasons. So this is partly conjectural, as most things about this battle, but substantially this is not important in a way. This is just a representation, but I'm telling you the story for, you know, without invented mechanisms. I'm simply telling you what the sources tell. Doesn't ruin the whole thing. So at this point, the horse archers of the Seleucids start to shower the Jewish center, the heavy infantry under Simeon, or Simon. I said Simeon. Well, okay, yeah, I said Simon before, but okay, let's keep calling him Simon. The source, the first book of the Maccabees, I remember clearly, it says that basically the horse archers shot against the Jewish infantry all the freaking day. That is from the morning to the evening, right? Now, this is maybe an exaggeration. I'm convinced of this. It seems that these horse archers had some sort of arrow replenishment of something, so they could shoot a lot of arrows. So it wouldn't be so strange. I mean, if you think about even Surinna at the Battle of Carrhae, 100 years later, in not very distant areas now, from Palestine, there was this functionality, and what it gets interesting at this point is that basically Jonathan orders a redeployment, and I change the picture. Wait a second. Okay. That brings the Jewish formation in a new array, basically the Jewish center in a different deployment. Excuse me. So this is important because actually all we have from this, I don't remember actually the square mentioned, that is something that I don't think it was said by the sources specifically, but here I represented it like a square. Because there was this plane theory, for example, that basically was the square that usually the phalanx applied during when it was I mean, not so standard. It was something pretty rare to do, and that definitely a very highly trained phalanx could do. But as we were saying before, probably this is not the case. We're not necessarily talking about a pikeman's phalanx, and the two things work in a dramatically different way, but maybe even not so much. I'm even kind of starting to get repentant to have made this picture here, because I don't really want to make you pass the idea that literally the Jewish center reshaped itself in a square fashion. Basically, some historians have suggested that this phalanx, or better, the usual phalanxes in the let's say Macedonian tradition could form these squares. And it happened 30 years before the Battle of Magnesia, for example. There are other examples of this, but they're, first of all, very desperate situations. This could be one of them. Like, really, you don't want to have horse archers showering your rear in a battle when you have, by the way, the enemy in the front with the bulk of his force there. So the term that is actually used in here to define what you read in here is this closening of the shield. that is basically is the what you see here is the synaspismos. Synaspismos, sorry. That basically really means to bring the shields together. So it would be like a shield wall, basically. That's this fables term that everybody likes, that I hate, because everything gets reduced to the shield wall, as if the shield wall was the resulted thing in every kind of thing. No, it's really not. And actually, it's a pretty lame thing that you have to do most of the times if you like this, like when you're showered by the enemy's force. I mean, the shield wall is not really how every single infantry formation should work, especially when they're fighting face to face to another enemy. It applies to certain specific systems that tend to fight in that way, very often for the lack of further means that to form this compact front that is always required by a good deployment and formation, but it's not really all about it. Ask anybody who was equipped, for example, with other forms of weaponry, like double hand grips, weapons, or other type of troops that even have a much more well, let's skip this part, but it's important here to understand that definitely if you have horse archers showering you, the best thing is to do is maybe have shields covering you. Now, at the same time, horse archers generally tended to make the enemy ranks spread while showering them with arrows. Why is that? Well, because simply when you open the formation, you tend to basically to be less frequently hit, right? Instead, if you have a very thickly compact formation, it's easier to hit. So what's the deal here? Well, the deal here is that probably the Jews did something comparable, let's say, to not really the testudo as we meant it, but definitely, being compact with closed shields to make a sort of continuous protection behind maybe someone else's shield, right? Which could tell, by the way, that the kind of equipment that was used by this heavy infantry was kind of typical of heavy infantry, really, since we were really wondering about the composition, because, probably, if traditional Jewish infantry didn't have quite large shields as individual fighters. It's not what you need. It's usually heavier infantry that really fight for pitched battles in these large formations, etc., that need heavier shields, because they tend to be targeted, in fact, more easily. So this synaspismos can really mean, bring the shields all together so that all these guys would kind of shield each other and their flank, and covering the enemy, the comrades' side in part with their own shield, and forming this kind of protection against archers. This is particularly important because it really can be explained, telling the truth, without the need to recur to a change in formation proper. For many reasons, actually. The first one is that you don't change your formation so easily. I mean, the myth that you can really change front or direction in a battle with a formation is something that you can do only if you're a pretty highly trained formation. Especially changing front, like literally, facing, turning 180 degrees is not really how armies are supposed to work if they have to work again for fighting, especially. But in this case, it was possible because horse archers probably didn't have a chance to attack in any way the enemy from the rear, and because they were light. Usually, horse archers are light, right? And this was perhaps, and it's not really a mistake to have sent them. And the reason could as well be that well, first of all, if you put a unit on the enemy rear, as we've seen, has a terrible psychological effect. Secondly, and also very importantly, it turns out that the posterior ranks of a formation are usually lighter. This is true for every single formation out there. and that's why you can't simply change front and engage a fight in the same way. And that's why armies taken from the rear are in freaking crisis, because men within the formation are disposed in a way that is functional to fighting in only one direction. That is to say that you're trained, basically, if you have that certain amount of training, to basically follow the guy who is in front of you, who is usually better than you. And you have the best guys in the very front. They're also very more heavily armored. So sending horse archers to the rear was a pretty good measure, even especially to probably make more hits in a way or another. I mean, to cause more casualties, actually, not to cause more hits practically, but let's say hitting in the ranks in the place that were softer already by themselves. The other problem, as we'll see now, is that while this is going on, the Seleucids do not attack. You see, this is really the best moment of the battle. When you have surrounded the enemy, you can press him from all sides. It turns out it doesn't happen. And the truth doesn't happen. The reason why this doesn't happen is likely that the Seleucids didn't have quite great phalanx quality. That's another hint, actually, to the fact that this phalanx that we see here is not truly the pikeman's phalanx. It's the Greek term that is used just to define more or less heavy infantry that at this point might have not even been so heavy. Here, these are damned militiamen from certain coastal towns from Palestine. What kind of heavy infantry might have ever been, right? Same goes for the Jews, that, however, probably at this point were having kind of lots of numbers, and probably also from large parts of Judea and beyond. So they probably had, at least in the front ranks, possibly even heavier troops than the Seleucids in this sense. Because the Seleucids here, at least we have no hint whatsoever that they were using the cream of their troops, of their potential. These were also barely Seleucids in the sense of the national contingents or the traditional tactical troops that we were talking about at the beginning. So the Seleucids don't press on the enemy, and this partly explains the fact further that the guys in the rear, sent in the rear, were horse archers, because if the Seleucids had really wanted to press the Jews at that point into a grip, they would have sent out there even kind of heavier cavalry, which is heavier than the average horse archer. Instead, they didn't. So this might have actually happened even if they hadn't had. This might have happened anyway, in the sense that still it was better to have heavier cavalry on the wings. So we don't really know. But this superiority, even in cavalry now, is debatable, and especially we'll see this at the end of the battle, right? But it was kind of a good decision. I mean, the Seleucids probably here were thinking that they didn't have enough force to dislodge the Jews from wherever they were with an attack, but they could wear them down and disorganize them throughout all the day long, seemingly, with this arrow shower from the horse archers. And naturally are also very different to catch, right? And the source says that basically the horse archers keep firing up to the point they exhaust their ammo. This is particularly interesting as well, but I don't know, I have the sense it's possibly an exaggeration. At the same time, we may think the Jews were, there is no evidence of this, but the Jews might have kept maybe shooting at the horse archers, because Wu tells us that the Jews didn't have archers or slings or other stuff that is actually pretty damn effective against horse archers. It is true that, as we've seen, that the Jews had employed their skirmishers now. Skirmishers, here we don't have any expressed, let's say, witness that the skirmishers had literally gone away or that they had stopped skirmishing. We just know that, you know, they don't come into the account anymore, so we have troubles to tell really how the story really is. But it seems that in part you know, maybe the Seleucids had wanted the Jews to exhaust their skirmishing capabilities to eventually be hit, to hit them better with horse archers once they had exhausted all their missiles in turn. So, you know, if you enter into the dialectics of this battle, you get that it's actually pretty fascinating. And let's go on with the synaspismos, actually, that we haven't quite focused on. So what was this synaspismos practice? Well, it might have simply been this kind of shrinking of the formation, paradoxically, not to make a better target, but actually for allowing a certain shield covering better. We can't exclude, actually, that part of this process might have happened by messing up really the ranks of the formation, which is not really to have transformed into a square like some, you know, hypothesize and suggest, but really maybe having made the guys from some ranks, forwarded ranks, into from the first ranks, let's say, backwards, like bringing shields there to have the ladder, because usually that's what you tend to have in the front of a formation. So now to parry, really to defend yourself from these horse archers that are literally shooting all the time, continuously at you, well, that's perhaps something similar. But even the concept in itself of synaspismos really, I mean, even etymologically speaking, really stresses the fact that you bring shields together. I mean, it's really that simple. It's not really very different from that. It's the idea that you theoretically even shrink the ranks, but to be more compactly protected by the shields. So in this sense, not having gaps in the front line, at least. This is important, and definitely you can imagine that some modification of sort among the ranks must have happened, because, you know, you don't just need guys in the front rank to have, I mean, in the rear rank, in this sense, from this perspective now, to stop the Arabs, but these Arabs could go over the heads and hitting people from the other ranks. So those ones were surely not giving their backs to the enemy fire, but trying, you know, to protect themselves as well. Because, by the way, we don't have any evidence here of several, I mean, actual chunks of formation, like deployed in depth, like different separated ranks here. So probably the battle line was a classical one. At least we don't have any other evidence to suggest otherwise. So how deep these ranks might have been? Maybe 8 lines deep. That was the average of the phalanx proper, and that's, yeah, I would say it's similar to the it could be with the one of other infantries, really, and so might have been the case as well. So I'm not sure whether we can pass to the 5th. Well, I would say yes at this point, because we don't really have much knowledge of what happened in the meanwhile. We know just that allegedly the horse archers exhausted their arrows. So we have this interesting indication just of the fact that the Jews coped with arrow fire with this synaspismos, whatever it was like. I'm prone to think that, you know, it was possible that the Jews definitely shot something back, right? It's perfectly plausible, but it's also plausible that this has happened because the horse archers had a major fire power, and still the Jews had to cope overall, because maybe they didn't have entire bodies of archers to deal with the horse archers of the Seleucids. So the what happens now is that there is seemingly an attack of the oh, by the way, it seems that the horse archers also got tired. This is important to consider. Remember that the horse archers, yes, they're behind the enemy lines at this point. So that is important because they can't be resupplied. They probably have some, of course, food and drink on the road, but at the same time they're out there disconnected from the rest of the army and potentially actually in a pretty serious situation, because yes, okay, they're on horseback, but they're still behind the enemy, so they can't escape from somewhere else, presumably, but still not in an excellent position. So in the also the Seleucids, we've seen it, the main block didn't do pretty much. So what happens is the horse archers get out of the way in a way or another. Either they have accomplished their duty, or they're tired, or whatever, they get away. So it's at this point that Simon brought forth his host, right? And this is the phrase from which a bit of misunderstanding comes from, and that I maybe overly emphasized before, because I've seen that some texts, this is from the book of the first book of the Maccabees, it translates this as if, all of a sudden Simon appeared. So it's as if he had entered into the battle now. But that's one of the cases of the first thing I told you before, in the introduction. Here the guy who translated the version, at least I have in English, of the first book of the Maccabees, of the Septuagint, didn't maybe care about the battle, hadn't studied about the battle, simply translated that Greek term as, which I haven't translated now actually, because I didn't even read that, that means to appear, maybe to arrive, to advance, and this guy translated it as to appear, as if the guy had come, as if Simon had appeared now into the scene from nowhere, and it doesn't quite sound right. So actually, if you look at the whole thing, how the battle developed, it's pretty reasonable that Simon had been always there at the same time, and that it was the one, by the way, it was under the fire of the horse archers, and while now, so there are no other elements, right? It's as if the horse archer fire had been a prolongation of the skirmishing, right? So this is aimed at the end of the day still to soften up the enemy ranks before the clash, and this may be as well a valid reason once again to explain why the Seleucid phalanx did not attack, because probably it was nothing particularly heavy, or at least they want to preserve an advantage that might be, however, still, we don't know the terrain at this point, but it would have been profitable to attack the Jews while they were targeted from the ranks, right? So if the Seleucids didn't attack, from what we can reconstruct of this battle, is about which we know so few, so it's just an hypothesis, it's possibly because the Seleucid phalanx was too weak to meet the Jews. That might have been, by the way, considerably more. So no, it's not necessary, actually, that the Seleucids were so weak, for example, from a qualitative point of view. As far as we know, even these coastal towns' militias might have been superior to the average Jewish heavy infantry. Who knows? I don't necessarily think so, but we have no way, in fact, to tell. But probably the Jews were also many, so even the number is particularly important, and that's actually also a valid reason for which you want horse archers targeting them to reduce them in number as well. But it's the same exact thing in terms of quality. Maybe you want just to knock out this solid guys. Maybe this Jewish heavy infantry was really pretty good actually, and that explains why in fact many Seleucids were weaker. We don't know. We can't play it around all you like. You will not find a solution because we don't know it. But it's important to think about it yet if you want to make a military analysis of some sort. So what happens at this point is the culminating phase of the battle, because here there are no other tricks, right? And what happens is that the apparently that the phalanx, the Seleucid phalanx, started to give way. I don't think we have any clear indication in here that it was a massive rout. As far as we know, even as relatively debatable, and because we don't know it once again, as it could be, this phalanx might have as well retreated quite orderly, and there is, or at least without breaking necessarily or immediately. And the reason is that the cavalries had not engaged immediately at the same time. Now, we don't really know why, because it seems from here the explanation is that the cavalries were still standing there while the Seleucid center was withdrawing, in a way or another. And it turns out that at this point, possibly the Jewish cavalry, possibly commanded by Jonathan himself, and I repeat, we don't know whether he was on the left, on the right. Here I placed him on the left, but because I'm following actually Varkochva reconstruction, but I think that it's even actually more plausible that he was actually on the right of the Jewish array, and that would be more sense. But here, basically, we know that Jewish cavalry had attacked directly Apollonius cavalry, right? The problem here, though, that complicates the story, that maybe now I'm starting to realize would have been better. The story of Simon appearing, right, bringing forth his host, is actually not really, I mean, it's ambiguous in the way it's translated, because it might as well been that he appeared from somewhere else. But the problem is, you know, what kind of synaspismus then you can make under fight of horse archers if your troops are just cavalry? And if the Seleucids were so confident in their cavalry superiority, okay, they might have been superior because they had horse archers, now were out of ammo, and they leave the rest of the cavalry maybe altogether wasn't that superior to one of the Jews. But you know, the synaspismus is, it sounds something you would make to do to infantry, right? So we don't really know. It's as if Simon troops might have appeared maybe later on during the battle, and this brought the, I mean, as if they had been a wholly different unit from the same Jewish infantry that was under Jonathan's command. That could explain why, for example, the Seleucids gave way. Or maybe it's possible that the Seleucid horse archers went away because Simon arrived and he routed them, maybe with other cavalry. So we don't really know what the hell happened. And in some reconstructions, here we see that in the fifth point actually that we wanted to reconstruct the thing in a more let's say classical way. That is, okay, now the cavalries attack each other, while maybe also the infantries begin to engage, right? So here it's really, maybe I should have modified actually this drawings, because I'm starting to think they're a bit confusing for this particular explanation. But I think that altogether they can give a better understanding, because it's really classical at this point that the cavalry is engaged, and maybe that the same infantry engage. So what happens in fact in here is that apparently the cavalry of under either Jonathan or other wing, the other wing, we don't really know, attacks Seleucid phalanx, while it's partly maybe already retreating, we don't really know. It seems that there was no, I think the sources do not really talk about a long engagement among the infantries. This is also particularly interesting. So it's as if this battle had been won. There is something suspicious in here, maybe just by the cavalries or the intervention of the Jewish reinforcements under Simon. We don't really know. That's how complicated it can be. We only know that basically the Seleucids retreat. So whether it began first with the cavalry, then it went on with infantry, or vice versa, we don't really know. It's actually pretty plausible that cavalry gives way quicker, more quickly, let's say, than the infantry, and that it's also probably, you know, and it's evidently in numerical inferiority compared to the infantry, but it's still vital for the protection of, say, infantry, that at that point, when it's without cavalry, cannot fight unless you know, there is no other enemy cavalry around. But once you rout the enemy cavalry, you can't, and you have cavalry still in your command, you can simply attack them from the flank, and you can rout them pretty easily. These maneuvers are pretty standard, right? And there is simply nothing so weird in the way this thing really could have gone. The problem is that we don't know the exact sequence, so it remains fairly, let's say, a problem, right? And usually, always think that in the Hellenistic tradition, by the way, it's the commander-in-chief that personally leads one of the cavalry wings. So also in here, which was the one that Jonathan was leading at this point, right? And that's pretty damn complicated. And the most striking thing in here is that there is nothing about the breaking of the Seleucid phalanx. It doesn't say that the phalanx gives way, as far as we know. And it's actually possible. It's possible that the phalanx started retreating before the cavalry, and that maybe the cavalry sacrificed itself to let them go, because actually it's pretty normal during a confrontation that when there is a withdraw, there is always one unit that sacrifices itself to let the others escape. So it's really a pretty big dilemma. It's a pretty interesting puzzle in many ways. And there are some who have talked, for example, about because some historians say it's not possible that the Jews had more cavalry than the Seleucids, so that they managed to defeat the Seleucid cavalry on the wings. The question is, what the hell do you know? We don't know how many cavalry the Jews had under their command. So how can you tell whether they were superior or inferior to the Seleucids? You have seen that the Seleucids were confident, but we don't overall about their forces before the battle. It's not even explicit. And after the horse archers get out of the way, we don't know about the maths of strength ratios, whether these troops were, you know, more, still, let's say the Seleucid cavalry left was superior still to the Jewish one. And even if the Jews traditionally didn't have quite a lot of cavalry, still, what the hell do you know that they didn't have? And I'm prone to think, overall, and this is really, the more I read about this battle, the more I think this is plausible, is that the Jews were really many. And that's the real point. And some have went as far as saying, you know, maybe the Seleucid cavalry fled because maybe the Jews attacked it together with infantry, not just with other cavalry. It's possible. But does this really answer the question? I mean, could have had the Seleucids make someone else join their cavalry with other skirmishers, etc.? You know, it's perfectly possible as well. We simply do not know. And Simon's, the problem with translation still remains. Did Simon really appear out of nothing? It was that but then why would really there is an interesting hint, though, is that when Apollonius provokes Jonathan to battle. The first book of Maccabees says that he got angry, so that might have been a sort of luring him hastily to the battlefield, or maybe and that was made appositely to break the Jewish forces in two, and then so that Apollonius wished to engage Jonathan's forces alone and annihilating them, and then before they could be reunited with Simon's one, and then Simon arrives during the battle, and then therefore the Seleucids give up and they retreat. We don't know. We don't know, and however, this is also a good hypothesis that may actually work. So I partly, abandoned my criticism towards the translation, but it's still not this simple. Meaning that the logic of the battle would actually suggest that at least. It's a more logical interpretation, at least in part, to think that Simon's forces were not necessarily already there before at the beginning of the battle, but at least that the bulk of the Jewish army was there still, and that therefore there was an infantry, and Simon was at the head of that infantry. Then what was Jonathan's? Assuming that Simon wasn't there yet, with what troops really Jonathan was making the synapspismos, really? It's particularly not clear, and I can't decide really what option sounds more probable, but at least Bar Kochva interprets it the way we have seen portrayed in here. But even also for him, that's a pretty, it's a mystery, right? And it's obvious because we can't really, and we don't really know. So whether it's cavalry that flees first from the Seleucid side or infantry, however, at this point it seems that the Seleucids break the unity of their formation. There is no specific mention about the route, but there is a point in which it says basically that after the battle, we don't really know when, if at the end of the battle itself, or maybe ahead, that the Jews kill 8,000 Seleucids in different ways. That would suggest that maybe they weren't even just killed in combat or during the route proper, or maybe that they were captured later and killed later. So this is also to bear in mind, and 8,000 losses actually are pretty high. Basically are the whole infantry, and this could kind of sensible. I mean, it can be that most of the infantry was annihilated. In part, they could have been taken prisoner as well. So it's relative in here can be an exaggeration, as we see. As we have seen before, there is no general consensus, not even about the size of these two armies. But the idea is that whichever these troops were, they kind of made a bad, they had a kind of a bad ending, let's say, one way or another. And no more specific details are recorded. So, basically, this was the battle about, and this is particularly fascinating in my opinion because it shows really a more I would say a realistic dimension of what let's say 2nd century BC Palestinian warfare could really be about. In a moment in which really the phalanx was declining, or partly was being reduced to a sort of it was being transformed, right? But largely it was dismissed, really, because it didn't really serve the purposes that it was conceived for, and because there weren't resources there. It was better to fight with this kind of different styles of fighting that also entailed maybe still heavy infantry, but more mobile and more, even in the Roman fashion, as it was called at one point. And this battle tells you really the difficulties of interpreting even a battle that at this point was relatively that is relatively simple. I mean, there is not a freaking much that we know about it, and that's naturally partly why we don't know so much, but actually also part of the reason why we know several things that, however, are difficult to recombine. So the two main interpretations of the development of the battle that start really from the myth of the clash in itself are pretty clear, right? They're basically about the difficulties that we have in interpreting whether the whole Jewish army was already deployed at the beginning of the battle, or if it was somewhat more, that it has still to arrive in part to the field, and it had to, and what the Seleucids especially were thinking about it, that whether they had lured the enemy into this ambush de facto, because the battle was conceived as one. And I'm actually starting to think that it's not so realistic to consider the wall of fort in this fashion, because it would partly be fitting with the idea that probably the Seleucids were not so powerful, and the idea that in fact these were just coastal town militia would reinforce this. Probably Apollonius wanted really to defeat the Jews pretty easily, splitting them in two sides, if it is really true that Simon arrived later during battle, and employing this means with the horse archers. And it's kind of a proof of a good command, actually. Probably Apollonius wasn't, I mean, it's still a bold move overall, even not just tactically but also strategically speaking, because eventually this brought to the failure of the, but it's still kind of clever, because in part this is an ambitious plan to wipe out the enemy forces in chunks, in a fashion that is really difficult to do otherwise, and especially with troops that probably are not in fact the mighty phalanx that one would think, and that are probably something very, very different. So this is, in my opinion, particularly interesting as a general consideration, and I think it can give at least a logical hypothesis to this battle. The theory that instead the Jewish army was all under one command is equally plausible, telling the truth. And I have difficulties, in fact, to prefer this explanation. I mean, to prefer the first explanation to this one. So it would be interesting to, but it's still kind of, both options make sense at the end of the day. And I don't think there is much to say about the Hellenistic tradition of this battle. I mean, it seems really something beyond Hellenism. Obviously, probably something about the composition of these troops can tell us something like, well, okay, they were maybe their own. This fact that the Jews had a fairly superior, troops. They had a higher number of cavalry, for example, even heavy infantry that you wouldn't think the Jews to have had at this point. Well, yes, but in my opinion that's still partly normal, and it's partly normal definitely of that specific Hellenistic context, but at the same time it's still plausible into other contexts as well. I mean, I don't see really the problem that would exist in thinking that the Jews could field a substantial amount of cavalry. Who knows, at the end of the battle it might have been possible that the you know the Jews overwhelmed the Seleucid cavalry with infantry or with other types of I don't know, with heavy fire from slingers and other troops that they surely had. So we don't really know, and it makes it more complicated. But at the end of the day, it seems that for whichever reason the Seleucid army kind of had to retreat. So there was something wrong about it in general, and I think that it might have been since the beginning. Otherwise, you can still control, interpret this traditionally, thinking that really, yeah, at that point, the horse archers out of the way really, really had, let's say, a brought to these two armies to face finally, getting to the big clash of the bulk of let's say of the two flanks as they're called by Josephus. At the same time, it's also fascinating that the Maccabees tells that the horse archers hit the Jews until the evening, and then magically Simon appears, or at least it advances, but even there it says that the archers get tired. So it's all these two options are still equally valid, right? And I hope I haven't confused you too much, but still fascinating. So, however, for now I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.